thanks so much for having me. I'm very happy to be here. I just said right to everyone has been super welcoming and super nice. It's been awesome for the last 2 weeks, and I'm going to say 2 more weeks. Yeah, as you can see, I will be talking about the philosophical commitments to LLM evaluations. And this talk is going to go through a bit of history of intelligence evaluations, both sort of like human intelligence, a bit of a natural artificial intelligence. Right. And without further ado, sort of the angle that I'm taking is from this question, right? So, question that many people working in AI, especially in philosophy of AI, are asking themselves, and there's a lot of disagreement about it as well, right? So, obviously, if you want to tackle this question, then you think, all right, where does this use come from? And I think I don't have to explain that in all the details with you, but there's these 2 views, the sort of like long-termist view and the short-termist societalist view, right? Whereas the long-termist view, they have these concerns about human extinction from misaligned or super intelligent AI, right? And they have their focus on value alignment and universal decision theory and many other things. Whereas short-term societalist people are more concerned about, like people having no jobs anymore, bias, and they focus on the sort of like societal side of things. And I find this distinction really interesting, especially because I think all of these people are sort of like coming from very professional backgrounds, right? It's not that I have made up opinions, and still they disagree really heavily about what that sort of like where should we go with this risk and what should we tackle, right? So to sort of illustrate this, there's this one view of the people who publish a lot about that. The sun is big, but super intelligence will not spare Earth in the sunlight, and stuff like that. And on the other side, they really criticize the sort of long-termism view, and there's toxic ideologies. There's this podcast that's called Mystery AI Hype Theater 3000 by Emily Bender. Eugenics and the promise of utopia through AI. Deep learning is rubbish. Okay. Well, and I think this is really interesting. As I said, that they are still fighting against each other. And I think we can learn a lot from that. So the sort of the angle that I'm taking from this talk is, why is there this massive rift between these 2 camps? And then obviously the question is, how can we explore this distinction? And one angle that we could take on here is to look at the intelligence definitions that they're using, sort of the underlying assumptions of intelligence. We could create a citation graph, right? Are they basing their thoughts on different literature? We could look at the demographics. So many people say they're sort of like gender coded, maybe what the risk might be. And Kate Crawford coined this term of uterus envy, right? That AI risk people want to create something, create life. So I find interesting. We could do a culture analysis. Is there something with values or religion coming into? We could look at power dynamics, which I also think is really interesting, right? Do they have any, like goals pursuing with this AI risk and stuff? But we can't do everything. So we're only going to do this today. And we look at evaluations and a lot of descriptive stuff about these 2 camps, and then a tiny little section about normative claims. Why is this interesting? First of all, I think we maybe might be able to make progress on the AI safety problem, especially coming to the question, why do people evaluate things so differently? Why do people look at the same test and draw completely different conclusions from it, right? We might refine our understanding of intelligence. That's more philosophically interesting. We could learn about underlying assumptions, right? So we could look at what biases do these both camps bring into, or under which paradigms do they work? And then this is sort of my personal agenda that I'm driving, that maybe you could open the doors for more cross perspective. I would just call it collaboration, because I think this all fighting maybe won't bring us anywhere at all. All right, and this is my outline. So we'll talk about, I call it natural intelligence, but what I really mean is just intelligence, but it's just to contrast with artificial intelligence. Then I have a very long section about artificial intelligence, so be aware from that. So we're going to go through the history of the testing and building and assumptions, and then I'm going to make an argument. That's why it's so long. But then the last two sections are really short, the evaluation problem and counter arguments and problems, and the conclusion is also very short. So maybe in an hour we'll be done with that, and then I'm hoping for a nice discussion. Yeah, and the good thing is we're already here. So first of all, this is how do you test intelligence? And people have been thinking about that at all. From maybe like 120, 130 years ago, right? But before we go to the testing approaches, just briefly summarizing what sort of philosophical positions were there, and you're probably all familiar with that. I'm not so much because my background is in science, so that was really interesting for me to go into that. Aristotle said that intelligence, and also please feel free to interrupt me and correct me if I'm saying bullshit here. Aristotle said something about that intelligence is something like the rational thought, and he contrasts this with sort of the sensitive soul. And said about ethical decision making that this is neither. This could be sort of viewed as practical intelligence, right? And then a couple of years later, many years later, Kant came into play, and he said something similar, right? That we have something like understanding and sensitivity. And these two together, operating under one sort of like consciousness unit or whatever you call it, would lead to the power of judgment or Urteilskraft, as he said it. And he also said, we need to develop these things, we need to have some sort of a priori knowledge. And then Leibniz, a couple of years later even, came to the idea that also abstract thought and reasoning come into play when we talk about intelligence. And he also said that for the first time that language might be a mirror into what intelligence looks like, right? And if you look at these definitions, I think if you look at these like rational, judgment, a priori knowledge, and especially abstract thought and reasoning and language, this is something that already reminds us very much of the current paradigm of what people understand from AI, right? This whole AI debate often talks about abstract thought and reasoning. Only planning is basically missing there, right? Cool. But as I promised, now I looked a bit into the tests of intelligence that people did in the early ages. And the first one, maybe some of you are familiar with Francis Galton, in the late 1800s came to first operationalize intelligence, or he even came up with this idea that we can test for something that is intelligence, right? He's a cousin of Darwin, and then Darwin came up with this evolutionary theory, and then Francis Galton set on to this journey of really he wanted to sort of show that there must be something different between him as white, middle class, upper class UK person versus other people in the world, right? So he set up to this journey and he said, okay, maybe we can test the processing time for some stimuli. I give you some tasks and you should do it, and I just collect how long you're working on that, and that defines people from intelligence. Obviously, this was so biased, and this was so biased to what he thought of him being intelligent, with arithmetic or something like that, that nowadays people talk about this as pretty unscientific. He also coined the word eugenics, and he also came up with a nature-nurture debate, taking these terms from Shakespeare. He also did a lot of other stuff. He had a lot of energy, but yeah, started off this intelligence testing. 10 years later, Simon and Binet in France were tasked from the French government to come up with intelligence tests that are a bit more reliable, and also here not to prove a certain point, but they're just this like more harmless thing. They wanted to give children educational support, and to define which children need educational support, they came up with some tests to define what they called mental age, right? And these tests were a bit more scientific, qualitative, quantitative. They tested for memory, reasoning, problem solving, and so on. And how these tests would look like, I brought some of you to them. So they had a test, and then it's defined from years 1 to 12 or 13, and had a couple of tests there, and then each child should do these tests and then sort of like record how many of these tests you could manage, and then the mental age that you will stop is your mental age, right? And then for 2 years old, there would be something like, you read it already. It's like some imitation, you know, you just clap your hands, and then a 2-year-old should also clap their hands, and then you reach the mental age of 2. Other tests
I think negativism and stubbornness are like pretty
yeah
throughout childhood as far
exactly.
as
Age 11 is something like, I'm gonna read a sentence and then you're gonna tell me what's wrong about it. And this is, I just put this pretty funny and cool. Also, yesterday there was an accident on the railroad, but it wasn't too serious. There were only 48 killed. And then the 11-year-old should say, okay, this is what is wrong with that. Or number 2, my favorite example, the police found yesterday the body of a young girl cut into 18 pieces. They think that she killed herself. Yeah, very cool. Another test would be something like this. Tell me as many nouns as you know, tell me as many words as you know, and then you should read 60 words in like 3 minutes. Or something like that. There's a scrambled sentence, so that would be 1 sentence. First, when I did this task, I tried to do all of this into 1 sentence. Didn't work. But yeah, and this also already reminded kind of the early ages of intelligence, artificial intelligence testing, right? You have a scrambled sentence. Cool. And then there was something like this. This is also a test for 11-year-olds, where it's a non-verbal test, and it's a picture completion test, where they leave out 1 feature of the picture, and then the child should say which feature is left out. So eyes, mouth, nose, and arms, right? And then what I was surprised to read in these papers is that they already are kind of, you know, so maybe taking it from this point, the test of natural intelligence testing, or the history of natural intelligence testing, is often said to be like very eugenic and so cruel, and this might be true, but actually they were already back then in 1906 pretty aware of what, like pretty aware, they were somewhat aware of the factors that could influence intelligence, right? They weren't claiming that they're measuring some absolute thing, right? They were already claiming that, all right, something like birthplace of mother or father, father's age, condition of mother's birth, whatever, comes into play there. Cool. More intelligence tests, because what we now know today as the IQ score is coming from this person, Louis Terman, in 1916, basically just took the Simon-Binet test that we just learned about, translated it into English, that was the first action, and then invented the IQ score. And the IQ score is just the mental age divided by the real age and then multiplied by 100, and then you have the IQ score. Again, criticized for being eugenic, and also for the first time being criticized as regarding intelligence as a fixed trait, which is also a criticism that still persists until today, right? Other tests were the Raven's progressive matrix by John Raven. I didn't bring a picture of John Raven, but I thought it's more important to have this there, that you know what I'm talking about. I think every one of us has seen these kinds of tests, right? And then the last, or like the most important intelligence test that we also still talk about today, and that is still being used today a lot, was Wechsler's intelligence scale. And he was one of the first people who really came to this conclusion that maybe verbal testing is not enough, right? Maybe if you give each other written tasks, then that is not enough. There's this story, I don't know, maybe it's true, maybe it's not, that he was in war and he met this Oklahoman, and the Oklahoman was really, really bad at all these verbal intelligence tests, but still he was really, really good at tool use. So he said there must be more than verbal intelligence. And then, so he came up with these non-verbal scales. I put the last point there because I thought it was interesting to also name Spearman. He came up with this G factor, the sort of like, he wanted for the whole lifetime of his whole research, he wanted to prove that there's something like a G factor that is correlating with all abilities, with all cognitive abilities that we sort of have, right? That's also where we have the correlation coefficient. Cool. And how these tests would look like, so this is the WAIS that we're still using today, would be something like this. And I think it's kind of interesting because he was like, you know, we have all these biases with people being educated and coming from the Western world, and maybe we shouldn't test on arithmetic and reading. And then what he did was testing on arithmetic and word knowledge. And this is also something that I think I saw a lot when looking into this test, that there was a lot of good intention, really, really like sincere good intentions, but then still the outcome was still maybe not that great. And then the non-verbal test would look like something like this, right? Something is missing in the picture, and to be honest, doesn't remind us of this. A little bit of these tests that also already have been, you know, like kind of criticized before. All right, but also Wechsler, and that's what I said with good intentions. Also, Wechsler was pretty sort of aware of that, right? We're unable to agree that it is unfair to judge the intelligence of a child except in terms of the average intelligence of its own social class. So that was nice to see. And then I think I already said it, but what we're still using today is this Wechsler intelligence scale, but with revisions to address cultural biases and ensure fairness across diverse populations. And the areas that we're testing today is verbal comprehension, perceptual reasoning, working memory and processing speed. And then the newest version, I found this interesting, it's only from last year. And then the newest version, you can look this up on Wikipedia, the newest version looks like something like this. So each picture that I'm showing you is one of these areas that I just named. Verbal comprehension is this, and they have vocabulary and information, perceptual reasoning, sort of like this is matrix reasoning, so just like wavelength progressive matrices that I showed you just a minute ago. Working memory, something like digit span, and arithmetic, there we have it again, and processing speed as well, coding and symbol search. So again here, sort of like coming back from the whole history of intelligence testing that we already had 100 years ago, we still have it today. It's still there. All right. Eric, give me this. I think it's really delicious.
Would you like another one?
Yeah, later, maybe. I'm a fan. And then sort of, I said there's common critiques, right, that have persisted over the years. So what are these critiques? We already heard that intelligence has been regarded as static and measurable, even though there are also studies that show that if you train for intelligence tests, you will be better at intelligence tests, right? Then a lot of critique is coming from the side that there's disadvantages for people from other cultural communities that are not Western, who doesn't know this, for whom doesn't know this acronym, it's Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic backgrounds. And then also more recent critique is that they just neglect many other sort of dimensions of intelligence. So emotional, social, creative, embodied intelligence is all not tested. Which is also interesting when thinking about artificial intelligence, obviously, right? One first clue, I should have made another slide for that, but one first clue is coming from Elizabeth Stalker in 2007, and she said something about the static and measurable as intelligence. She said, okay, maybe this is just, maybe we just have two opposing views of intelligence. Maybe it's just that those people don't regard it as static and measurable. Maybe they just think it's specialized, so that learning is shaped by evolution and predefined capabilities. and sort of that the human species is sort of like programmed to learn what they can learn, and that's why we can measure them on these terms. The other view is this more general skill acquisition ability that people also talk about a lot nowadays in artificial intelligence, right? That we can basically learn anything. And I've started color coding this a little bit. I will remind you of this color coding 2 more times in this talk. And I'm not sure if I've overdone it a little bit. I'm going to introduce 2 more colors. But sort of the red stands for specialized and the blue stands for general. And she calls it 2 opposing views of intelligence, but really I think what it is 2 opposing views of learning, right? You can either learn what you're programmed to do, or you can learn just everything that is in the world, right? Cool. So takeaways from this part on natural intelligence is that there's core concepts of intelligence that have been theorized over, and these are rational thought, abstract thought, reasoning, language. That the intelligence tests that we're using today are the intelligence tests that we used 100 years ago. That there's many critiques about natural intelligence tests. And that the efforts to address these biases and to address these critiques, in my opinion, didn't really work. Cool. So, longest part, but we can get through it together. So whenever you talk about artificial intelligence, you always, or many people, I guess if they don't start with a mechanical Turk example, they start with Dartmouth. And this is what I'm going to do as well. I think the history of artificial intelligence testing or artificial intelligence evaluation is a little bit harder, because when you look at the human, it was really just about how to evaluate these things or how to test for intelligence. If you talk about artificial intelligence, also how to build these things, right? So there's building and testing, and only, as I said, there's only testing. So this is going to be a bit more like this, jumping from points to points. But all right, so we're going to start with Dartmouth. All of you know that there was early optimism and that people thought they're going to figure this out in 2 weeks, right? And when I sort of thought about this talk for the first time, when I thought about moving goalposts, that's in the title, I thought, okay, there's the thing that intelligence is first chess until someone builds a chess computer, and then there's language until someone solves language, and now intelligence, planning, and reasoning. And I kind of wanted to show how this is weird, but then if you look at this early proposal, it's actually not that true. Like, they already thought in 1955 about all of these areas, right? They thought about, so this 3-page proposal or something like that, wasn't right? But they thought about, okay, automatic computers, so how can an agent live for itself? How can we use language? How can we use neural nets? Space-time complexity of calculations, even self-improvement, abstractions, and I was most fascinated about randomness and creativity. So this is, all of that is already in there, what we are talking about today. So maybe it's just not true that these goalposts move, or like my initial idea was just not true, right? And then 3 years later, this theoretical physicist, Richard M. Friedberg, I don't know why he only has this like color picture, and this is sort of weird because every other picture is black and white from this period, but maybe there was some like recoloring. But anyways, he said that if we ever, so that was a bit more deeper thinking about that, right? If we ever make a machine that will speak, either we must reduce these activities to a science that is so exact, blah, 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 or we must develop a machine that can do things without being precisely told how. And there we have the color coding again, which sort of the one thing he really acknowledges, either we have to have these specialized systems that are learning what they're told to learn, or we have these machines that sort of like just learn whatever they see in the world. And one person did the one thing in this very year, Rosenfeld, who invented the perceptron, right? This sort of like early, super simple algorithm, everyone knows it. And then a couple of years later, Weizenbaum, who invented ELIZA, there was really this sort of like reduced rule-based system to emulate something like, well, language, yes, but intelligence, we don't know, not really like. Cool. The next thing that people talk about when I talk about the history of artificial intelligence is obviously the AI winter, where people had setbacks because maybe it was a bit too ambitious and they cut the funding. And so researchers started not talking about AI anymore and they went into these silos, right? They were just like, okay, I'm just going to do chess now. And the philosophical perspective came from Hubert Clarkus. How you all know, he said that maybe we'll never get to artificial intelligence because these things are not embodied and these things are not contextual. And then John Searle, a couple of years later, with his Chinese group experiment, thought experiment, right? I think all of you know what this is all about, right? Cool. Oh, I forgot to change the font there. Well, then Marvin Minsky came into this tradition of siloing. He said, okay, maybe we need just stuff, and here I'm starting to color code for the second color. Maybe all of the intelligence that we're building should be more task specific, right? He said AI is the sense of making machines capable of performing tasks that would require intelligence done by humans. And this yellow signifies this task specificity that came up in the 80s versus the general flexibility that people also said. And this is sort of how we should build AI. Is it task specific or is it general? And then people created task-specific systems, chess in 77, transformer in 2017, and that's about it for the history. Cool. Here's a reminder for the color coding again. So I said the one is learning, the other one is how to build and evaluate AIs are either task-specific or flexible and adaptable. Good. And then out came, and maybe, yeah, we're still talking about intelligence definitions and intelligence testing. So why am I going through all of this history? Well, we saw there's a couple of streams, right? Like task-specific, general, or house learning specialized, or basically everything general as well. I don't like that the general in learning and that the general flexible in how to build AIs is the same word, but I couldn't figure out how to say it differently. But anyway, out came this paper in 2007 that was really big, and maybe some of you have read it, by Shane Legg and Marcus Hutter, in which they, well, this was the second paper out of truth. In the first one, they looked at 70 definitions of intelligence, and they tried to figure out what is the wrong definition of intelligence that we can find amongst these definitions. And they came up with this. They said intelligence is an agent's ability to achieve goals in a wide range of environments. Probably all of you have heard this definition, right? It's pretty famous. And what I find so interesting about this is that now we have these both dimensions of intelligence sort of like accumulated in this definition. So the task-specific skill, right, that there's a single goal to achieve goals. And then there's this sort of like general and adaptable skill. Well, I don't know if adaptable, but general in a wide range of environments. Right? That was 2007. And then out came this paper 12 years later, which was yet another paper on the measures of intelligence. But also, François Chollet was the one who proposed this ARC corpus, this abstract reasoning corpus, that many people talked about. And why am I, and we're going into this paper a little bit in depth, and why am I doing this? Because it was from both camps, from the AI existential risk camp and also from the society camp, regarded as like really good benchmark. And now it's broken for some reasons that we can go over, or maybe in the discussion, but and I think this is also, it's just a good read, and there's a lot of good thinking about intelligence definitions in there. So first of all, he sort of characterizes the current state of intelligence definitions, and he says that the deep learning, the current deep learning in 2019 that we see is this connectionist inspired tabula rasa. And here again, I have this blue coding because it really much goes into it, and I think it's very true, goes into this everyone, or like intelligence is if you can learn everything. Tabula rasa, I think Leibniz also covered. Yeah. Locke, John Locke. Right, anyways. So he says that the mind in this viewpoint is viewed as flexible and adaptable in general, right? And experience is transformed into like whatever. This experience is everything. There's nothing before. He doesn't say exactly how, but he will answer this question later. And then he said, okay, what is the problem with that? That even though we think that we're measuring this general and adaptable whatever skill, what we actually are doing is solely measuring a skill at a given task. And this falls short of measuring true intelligence, because skill can be bought if you have a lot of data and then you can optimize for a skill. And he says this is a problem. So how to do it better? So you need to be precise and quantitative about these measures of intelligence. And he said, okay, we have to be close to humans. So how are humans doing stuff? And he said we have 3 levels of priors. First level of prior is low level priors. Something like I can perceive a color, I can perceive a sound. But he said this is also way too specific to be out of interest for artificial intelligence. So we disregard the low level priors. And then we have the meta learning priors, and then we have the high level knowledge priors. And talk about meta learning priors and high level knowledge priors, and then about ARC, and then this is done. Meta learning priors, he said, are the priors that shape how we learn and acquire knowledge. So this is the answer to sort of what is intelligence, shape how we learn and acquire knowledge. He says humans have these meta learning priors to efficiently adapt, which is already sort of this contradiction to what he said before, that the current learning is this tabula rasa state, right? He says we have something like meta learning priors already. And then he says this interesting thing that puzzled me so much, and he said meta learning priors should be of utmost interest, but are not relevant to evaluating intelligence. They are intelligence. And then I was like, what? Like, why? Like, if you say they are intelligence, why do we not test for these meta learning priors? And maybe, I hope we can discuss this, but I was just so puzzled by that. Because there's all of these, in my opinion, interesting things about learning, how can we acquire knowledge, but maybe this comes from a different viewpoint, right? Well, and then he says, okay, maybe we should look at high-level knowledge priors, and these high-level knowledge priors are something like objectiveness. So what defines an object, and what happens with an object if I let it fall from the sky? What is an agent, and like perceiving other things as an agent, and then sort of like seeing that they do like some goal-directed behavior. Natural numbers and arithmetic, there we have it again, and some elementary geometry topology. And then, so he took this from Spelke, who defined the true opposing views of intelligence. And she also said that there's also something like social intuition, but he didn't take this into his ARC challenge. He was like, no. And so he developed this ARC challenge. Maybe we can go over that. One interesting thing that he said, and this is going like a golden thread through all of these benchmarks that are broken right now, is that he said we shouldn't rely on any learned symbols that can be learned from any training data. And so that, because this is again skill specific, and this can be bought, right? And we will see how this is violated across the board. Cool. And so he defines intelligence, and there are all colors in there. He defines intelligence as the measure of its skill acquisition efficiency over a scope of tasks with respect to price and experience and generalization difficulty. There is all dimensions that I've just sort of like named where it's general and learning, but it also has some task specific aspects to it. But yeah, how does he do it? He did this abstract reasoning problem, probably most of you know it anyways. And these are these picture completion tasks. This is a rather complex one, right? But he was sort of inspired by psychometric tests. This is no surprise at this point anymore. He took the Raven's progressive matrices as sort of like you are learning from 3 pictures how something should look in the solution, and then I give you 1 picture and you should create the solution, right? We see some more examples. And there he really focused on, and this I think is so interesting, he focused on generalization and he focused on controlled experiences, right? So the first one is generalization, is that you don't see 100 examples of this task, you don't see 50 examples of this task, you see 3 examples of this task, and then you should be able to complete it, right? And the first one was the second one is to control for experience. So maybe it's also good if you don't have this stuff in your training data. And later, so there was this ARC challenge and 2 algorithms or more algorithms sort of like broke the benchmarks or got like 55% or something in accuracy. And that was so interesting because there are 2 streams. The first one, they just sort of like self-created more training examples. The other one self-created more task examples. So they violated both algorithms that broke this benchmark, basically violated the rules of the game, which I think is so interesting. And obviously O3 also broke it, but yeah, we don't know how. Maybe it was in the training data. Yeah. This is one task where you have, like you have a lot of noise, and you should learn to denoise the object, and this should test for objectness priors. Goal directedness priors, in each image, you have these 2 blue dots, and then they continue in a green line, and as soon as they bump onto this red object, they bounce off. Okay, something like this. And what does it remind us of? Maybe a little bit of this completion task that we've already seen a lot. Obviously, way more complex. It also has been criticized for being even too complex. Even humans only reach like 80% accuracy on that. But yeah. So how does this relate to the error risk debate? I already said before that this benchmark was well regarded from both camps. So this is interesting. Now it has been broken, and one camp is really like, oh, it has been broken, and the other camp is really like, oh, but they violated the constraints of the game. So I thought maybe we can look at other benchmarks and sort of like classify them into what community subscribes to them, or what did they build. So the Extras community, and then the comments all have been broken, right? The Extras community has like the Turing test, ArcAGI, as I just said. Then there's Hella Swag, maybe you've heard of that. It's like sentence completion. More like MMLU is knowledge, and then there's math, and then there's coding, and then there's math problems again. Ethical reasoning hasn't been broken. Very interesting. And then there's more like big bench and instruction following. And what I think what I also said beforehand, right? What I think is so interesting that this very much violates what Cholet said about that it shouldn't rely on any, like learned symbols, because this very much relies on learned symbols. Or it doesn't really go into this. It's also very task specific, right? It doesn't really go into this, oh, we test for generality and adaptability. And of course, if you test language models for language, like or for intelligence, you have to use the symbols that you're given with. But we will see in this community that somehow they are more clever about it, I think. more like cognitively inspired. So they have benchmarks like, I know this talk is said to be about LLMs, but then I couldn't be restricted to LLMs. So one visual benchmark is this, they call it Animal AI Olympics. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but yeah, so it's like, I explain it anyways. It's like these simple tasks that you've all seen on TV where there's food hidden somewhere and then a dog or an ape or whatever should get to this reward. And then they would give that a visual system. And see how it does. And then there's this phantom benchmark that has theory of mind in a very cognitively inspired way. Concept arc actually based on the original arc, but like way simpler and more based on concepts, that it has many different concepts with a lot of tests. Cultural adaptability, self-awareness, and world knowledge. So they're kind of some are like inspired by these traditional psychometric tasks, right? But some are also completely like cultural adaptability, self-awareness, theory of mind are very like novel concepts of cognition, I would say. And then there's also a big stream of people who are just completely against benchmarks, like Melanie Mitchell, Emily Bender. They heavily disagree with the concept of benchmark at all because they say benchmarks only test this one really specific thing in the world, but then there's all the world that sort of like we don't test for, right? There's a reason why there's no benchmarks for everything that humans can just do so seamlessly, like acting in the world. Yeah, that is just not been tested for. Cool. More definitions of intelligence, because this still, well, it gives us some sort of picture. It's sort of with my color coding, I'm saying here that these are really task specific, and these are more, at least try to be more general, right? And then I found these intelligence definitions by Josh Henbaum, who's a cognitive scientist. He gave this talk at the IPAM workshop, which is called, he also gave it at NeurIPS, but you can see it on YouTube, called Scaling Intelligence the Human Way. And he very interestingly combines what you have like the current deep learning paradigm and what human minds, and he calls it tomorrow's AI should look like or could look like. And he has 3 points, and the one is saying that the current deep learning paradigm sees AI sort of, or like intelligence as sort of like the end result of learning, something that we can train for, and then we have intelligence, and then that's it, then that's done. Whereas the human minds would be sort of like the foundation of learning. It only enables us to learn something. We have intelligence, and we have maybe like something like meta learning prize, and based upon that, we can learn. And we don't need like half a year of training data to learn a specific thing, but we can learn actually from 1 or 2, max 3 examples, many things, right? He also says that generalization depends on, for the current AI paradigm, depends on what is in the training data, right? And if we don't have a general spread of the training data, then everything we can generalize over only extends like very weakly beyond that. Whereas if you build world models and have mental models of the world, how an actual human like operates in the world, like if I know how to flush a toilet in Hong Kong, I know how to flush a toilet in Denmark, right? I don't need super many examples for that. And then lastly, he says, thinking is the process that current AI and deep learning paradigm use as that it derives from language, right? That you can test thinking through language. Whereas how, and he's this cognitive scientist who has this task of reverse engineering the human brain and works on all these Bayesian, the Bayesian paradigm very much. So he says thinking precedes and enables language, right? So this is something that we have to have first, and then we can put the tool of language up on that. Like it's a very powerful tool, but it only has been added to the human toolbox very recently in the whole evolution of humans, right? We are thinking we could use tools before we had language. Yeah. So what I am about to offer you is this distinction, and this is not really, these are not like coined terms or something, but they do map onto some concepts that you can read up in this literature. So the one is sort of like this intelligence realism and this universal intelligence view, right? Where they sort of see, okay, intelligence is the end goal of learning, and also intelligence follows these discoverable, universal mathematical principles. Like we can describe intelligence as a concept, and this is also why we can test for it. And there exists this perfect algorithm, so that's why we can use different metrics to see how people do on these metrics. And different forms of intelligence are all just one implementation at one stage of this universal intelligence matrix. And when we now understand the human intelligence, that would tell us something about the artificial intelligence, right? And then the opposing view to that would be something like intelligence pluralism or ecological intelligence, how I call it. That intelligence is more inherently tied to what you see. And maybe this maps more onto that you have innate priors that sort of like give a sort of scaffolding to what you can learn, right? That there's no single intelligence, but there's many intelligences. And that maybe even different types of intelligence could be incompatible to each other. Like we have a poor track record, Choulet said this in his paper, of even recognizing and acknowledging other forms of intelligence, right? Like octopus and dolphins, whatever. Yeah, I mean that obviously you are intelligent because you interact in an environment. It's not a closed book. So this is again what I offer to you is that maybe these risk communities map onto some views of this intelligence. And why should they do that? So there's this existential risk community that sort of says, okay, the scaling hypothesis has some, like noise and things that are not so clear about it, but it's broadly true. Like we can scale up a system and then we go super intelligence, like something that is more intelligent than us. So on this universal intelligence path, so we just go ahead and then we have super intelligence, right? And this is also visible as in they use still these psychometric tests from 100 years ago. They don't really try to alter these or try to improve these. They just sort of like adjust the difficulty a little bit. They also say, and this relates to the scaling hypothesis, obviously, that strong performance on these benchmarks is sort of like what signifies AGI, right? We will get, if we just train more, this intelligence will surpass us, right? So that would lean towards intelligence realism, how I coined it. And then the societal risk community, on the other hand, they say, no, scaling is not sufficient to achieve some level of human intelligence, or even, well, maybe we can go into this in a discussion, but okay, yeah, scaling alone is insufficient. This is also simplified, obviously, but the psychometric tests that we had from 100 years ago, they're task specific. So very much along the lines of the against benchmark people. We only test one specific thing, and we should test the adaptability of intelligence, right? What is missing for AGI are all of these components that humans have. Meta learning, causal reasoning, innate priors, generalization, and AGI, I really mean this terms of like general intelligence, as it's we can act alone in the world. I mean, there's many definitions and probably none of them are true, but yeah. And then they say current AI remains narrow, and that's why we're not interested in the long-term AI risks. There's many more risks that we have currently, and we should focus on these. So I would say they lean towards intelligence pluralism, right? And to bring this a bit more into sort of the practical realm, of what we see today. I looked at some people that I think agree with one of these intelligence views and also very much agree with one of these risk camps. And I haven't read all of these in detail. It's my sort of understanding. So this might be wrong, but let's see. So Ilya Zelikovsky, the very much existential risk person, he's also very much for we can discover universal decision theory and we can discover universal principles of intelligence, right? Marcus Hutter literally wrote universal intelligence as a paper. Joshua Bengio, as I understand it, works on the fundamental universal principles of intelligence. And François Chollet also talked about the ability, intelligence, the ability to universally generalize, right? In between, or maybe not in between, maybe I just don't understand it enough, is Geoffrey Hinton, who's very much in the AI risk camp, actually. He works on the universal principles of neurocomputation, but he also kind of acknowledges that, well, there is some specificity of biological evolution and implementation. Stuart Russell, very much AI risk camp, works on universal approaches to AI alignment, but very much acknowledges value pluralism. So we can't just align on one value. And then there's this other question of value pluralism, goes hand in hand with intelligence pluralism. That's another question that we could discuss later. Jan LeCun works on universal world models. World models now is more the term from, I would say, the pluralist side. Gary Marcus, and then last but not least, the pluralist side. So Josh Tenbaum works also on universal principles, but he's very much open about that as human universal principles, and he very much acknowledges other forms of intelligence. Melanie Mitchell always says that AI and human intelligence will be fundamentally different. Timnit Gebru says how all these capabilities are culturally shaped, right? And then last, Emily Bender, very much saying that meaning and context is super contextual, right? Cool. So I put this on a graph, and I think it's a bit funny, but it would look like this. And this is obviously wrong and incomplete and imprecise, but sort of what you can see, or what I imagine in my head, that is something like, the more you agree with intelligence realism, that there is this universal intelligence function that you can figure out, the more you lean towards the existential risk.
But it should be in the bottom.
Yeah, but is he really? Yeah, because I saw this one.
What's that? Yeah, no, I know him very much.
Oh, really? Okay, because I saw this one paper where he was like, there's two risks from AI, and this is job placement and bias. But those
Marcus.
yeah, I think 2018 or something.
He's not less of a shit about discrimination.
Nice.
He's very much in the
Yeah, cool, thanks. Yeah, I'll change that. But that's sort of how it looks like, right? How I imagine it to be. Right. And then what I find more interesting about it, if you think about it, is that I think that there are often these claims of we can find out universal decision theory, or we can find universal value alignment or something like that. But it seems that all of these attempts to find correlability, robustness, even universal evaluation frames, right? They always hit the limits that would rather suggest that maybe pluralism is more true, right? So they always go into specification challenges, frame problems, context dependence. So this is what I find is really interesting about that, right? This is a shameless plug. It's a former collaborator of mine, Jen, but she wrote a lot on this topic of pluralist value alignment. Okay, so this is done. This is the longest section of the talk. It's done. Now we have the takeaways. What are the takeaways? So it seems that both risk camps do agree that AI should be built and should be evaluated flexibly, generally, adaptively, right? In this like sort of cognitive measuring. But they really differ on how they address that. The ones that have these static type task specific tests, and the others try to be more cognitive about that. Deep learning currently assumes that intelligence is the end goal and that thinking derives from language. This is what Tenenbaum said. Whereas the human mind, or like tomorrow's AI, or more the AI that we're looking for, treats intelligence as a foundation, and also language as enabled learning. And this is what I think that the existentialist camp broadly aligns with intelligence realism, who are viewing intelligence as this universal function that you can find out. And the societalist camp broadly aligns with intelligence pluralism, who see intelligence as context dependent, very much not the same across species. And the challenges in universalist alignment might be, and there's a lot of noise, right? There's not all of these challenges can be explained, but some of these challenges might hit limits of context dependent specification, frame problems, everything that suggests maybe a bit more pluralist view. Cool. And then we have two brief sections. Then I'm excited for a discussion. So we have asked us, this joint work with my collaborator Chira. We have asked us, okay, why is this evaluation so hard? And then we thought about it and we read a little bit about it, and we said, and this is also in the title, so moving goalposts is one problem in observational relativity, right? And the sort of here's the reminder for color coding, because it gets heavy in the next slide. But one is learning, one is building and evaluating AI. Moving goalposts is the first problem. It's sort of like what I said in the beginning, what I actually wanted to do with this talk, that intelligence is first chess, and then language, and then it's planning and reasoning. But maybe this is actually only true for the intelligent realism camp. Maybe they are just the ones who haven't changed the definition since the 1900s. Sorry, this is only true for the pluralism camp. The intelligent realism camp, they're the ones who haven't really changed the definition in their tests since the 1900s, right? They really must test on the really still test on these task specific, also just criticized tests that we have had early on. What I said before, that the difficulty has changed, I think. And then the intelligence pluralism side, they're the ones who sort of develop new tests as there are more metrics, more cognitive metrics that we discover about intelligence or humans with humans. So something like theory of mind, cultural adaptability, self-awareness, and stuff like that. That's what I say there. So again, that graph. I hope you don't mind. So how I imagine it in my head is something like this, that over time, the test diversity has gone up in the intelligence pluralism side, but was kind of like not really changed, maybe when it was a bit more difficult from test to test in the intelligence realism side. And this is the second thing, the observational bias. Why we think it's hard to evaluate system is that you have this observational bias. Thrown inside observer bias is the tendency of observers that to not see what is there, but instead to see what they expect or what they want to see. And this is a picture of this clever hands horse. And I don't know if anyone doesn't know what clever hands was, but it was this horse that could do math, right? But actually it was like tapping its foot, and then it just stopped on the correct number, and it saw the correct number because his trainer gave a certain like look in his face or something, did a certain thing. So this is the start of like we want to observe what we want to see, and we define it as the bias guiding the process of generating and testing a set of relevant cognitive words. So you're like, I think this is important for intelligence, and so that's why I test this certain ability, right? And then, yeah, I also said this before that we're pure track record. This is just to say that we have this observer bias and that we have seen it in history, that we sort of underestimated intelligence maybe of octopi and dolphins, and at the same time we overestimated some other intelligences of Eliza, for example. All right, and if you again put that into the two views of intelligence realism and intelligence pluralism, then I would say that intelligence realism, if you have this assumption that humans are somewhat close to the universal intelligence algorithm, then it's completely fine to also use human intelligence to evaluate AI intelligence, right? And if you're operating under this premise that intelligence is sort of the goal and that thinking is that language is enabled, that thinking is enabled by language, then it's also fine to have all these metrics that we saw, these benchmarks that we saw, right? Whereas for intelligence pluralism, if you have the assumption that humans are only one implementation of one intelligence, then you probably attempt less to go to saying that if an intelligence system sort of displays traits from that also humans can do, then you're sort of less inclined to say, okay, but that's artificial general intelligence, or this is something like super intelligence, right? Cool. Again, my bad graph on this. So this is how I imagine it, that intelligence pluralism very much moves the goalposts of what intelligence is, and I think that's not really a bad thing because we discover more about the humans. Whereas they acknowledge that there is observational bias, but it's also less of a problem because if you want to know about humans and how close an AI is to a human, then that's totally fine. Whereas intelligence realism, the sort of more existential risk view, very much suffer from this observational bias, I think. And they don't move their goalposts of what intelligence defines, but they have still the psychometric test from 100 years ago. Cool. Problems and counterarguments, and maybe I skip counterarguments and we just go to the discussion, to be honest. So problems with intelligence realism is still the same problem that we had 100 years ago, that if you, I think Tyler Cohen had this thing, every thinker is a regional thinker kind of saying. And obviously, if you have this observationally biased perspective to evaluating intelligence and to evaluating AI, then you also get to just build, these are non-problems, right? Build data sets that are super biased. Some like ImageNet, one of the biggest image source, super biased. This is all no news to us, right? Then I made an argument about dehumanization through AI and AI enforcing the right racial frame. These are all, again, known problems, but I just wanted to highlight them again in the context of intelligence realism. Concept of intelligence has been weaponized. Again, I think I skipped the counter arguments and we'll just go to future directions of this research or of this project. So first, obviously, now that I suggested that, it's the question of how can we test and build and align systems in a more pluralist way, right? So cooperative AI and how's it called now? Blanking on this word. Constitutional AI. They go more into this direction, or pluralist value line. Thank you. How can we de-weaponize intelligence and promote social benefit? How can intelligence not be a sort of like, this is good and bad, and you're on the scale of like lower or higher, right? How can we actually come to normatively acknowledging that there's different forms of intelligence? And then what I said in the really beginning, what are other ways in what you can see how these communities differ? And this is something I would really like to pursue. So if anyone's interested, let me know. Researching about like demographics and power dynamics in these communities. Cool. So takeaway from this talk, I think I just put them on here and then you can read them on your own. And then I can just walk a little bit through the slide. So my last slide is this. Thank you very much. This is my collaborator, Tira. it's me and, yeah.